Welcome to our June session of Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom, hosted by the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. For folks who are returning to our webinar series, you'll notice that I am the only one moderating with our featured guest today because my colleague Jen was called away at the last minute, but she'll be rejoining us for our July session. So I'm very, very excited to introduce our guest. Paroma, thank you so very much for joining us. You are a principal at the Brattle Group, which I think many of our audience members are familiar with, but I was wondering if you could just give us one or two bullets, quick note about yourself and your work at Brattle Group before we get into what you've been up to most recently.
Sure, Carolyn. But first, I'm delighted to be here. It's very exciting to talk about spectrum, especially at this point of time. So at the Brattle Group, we are, an economic consulting firm. We do everything from competition policy to electricity to telecom. But I particularly lead the telecom, media, and entertainment practice. I co-lead it with a colleague. And my primary focus, of course, is like all things telecom and internet and media.
Well, thank you again for making time to join us. And there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot going on with respect to spectrum, not the least of which is whether or not the FCC is actually going to have its authority to conduct auctions restored. But I really just wanted for folks online, if I was prepared, I would have put the link in the chat. A report was co-authored by you and published back in the spring of 2023, and the title is How Much Licensed Spectrum is Needed to Meet Future Network Demands. So if you could just walk us through a little bit, number one, what did you guys look at when you were trying to answer this question? And then ultimately, what is the answer that you guys came to?
Let me provide the spoiler first. And the spoiler is that if we really do not have any new spectrum, by sort of 2027 and then by 2032, even with all the growth in other kinds of infrastructure and, growth in small cells, macro cells, increased spectrum efficiency, despite all that, the US will have over 400 megahertz of deficit in the next 5 years. And that grows to a whopping like 1,500 megahertz in the next 10 years.
So let's go back over that again, because I think people don't necessarily appreciate, the import of what you just said, which is you can have small cells, you can have fiber builds, you can do all of that densification with equipment, but yet you are still going to see the networks in the US hit a wall in terms of capacity if no additional full power licensed spectrum is made available.
Right, that's exactly right. And for that, I think, as you mentioned, walking through a little bit of our methodology, like sort of high points sort of might make sense, because I think often what we miss is, it's a trade-off. You can do all this stuff. Yes, you can. And our analysis takes that into account. And this is an even then, here is where we land.
Really, really important point, because you often see in some of the advocacy, less in the technical discussions, more in the advocacy space, people create the impression that somehow these wireless companies are just not building. They would rather just buy spectrum as if spectrum's for free, kind of overlooking the billions of dollars that are paid to obtain access to it, but creating the impression that somehow they're just sitting on their hands and not doing the build on the equipment. So that's a really, really important point. If you wouldn't mind, could you walk us through the high points in terms of what you guys looked at in your research and data analysis to come to the conclusions you did?
Sure. So it's at the core of it, it's sort of a demand and supply model. Mm-hmm. The first thing we look at, of course, is network demand. And I think, as all of us are aware, there's been a huge increase in data demand over the past years. So we look at various sources like Cisco and Ericsson and forecast sort of the data demand for the next 10 years. Now, of course, for 10 years, you need to get a little creative. Wish we all had a crystal ball, mm-hmm. But we do our best given sort of the forecast we've seen in various publications. And as many of you might have seen, actually, like a former colleague of mine just sent me the Ericsson data forecast this morning. And it appears from their last one, we had used like a 23% CAGR, and now it's 25. So one takeaway is, in this paper, we've actually probably underestimated demand.
Oh, wow.
Which was very interesting to see, because we thought a 23% CAGR was quite high.
Right.
But now they're projecting even higher, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the actual demand forecast.
Can you, for anybody who's listening or watching that doesn't understand what CAGR stands for, could you just explain what that acronym is?
So very simply, it's like, a compounded annual growth rate. So think about how much data is growing, sort of, using that year on year, right. And that allows you to project sort of, the future years. So just looking at that, what we forecasted is, the data is going to increase like almost 2.5-fold in the next 5 years, and sort of and almost, I think, 6-fold in the next 10 years. Now that's a huge data growth, right? But what underlies this, the other thing we do, it's not just a typical forecast. We also look at the mix of data. Because that's important, because every data type uses the spectrum differently. So while doing this forecast, we also look at how the mix of data is changing between 2G, 3G, 4G, and ultimately 5 and like kind of 6G by 2028. And given that, then we sort of put that together to come up with sort of a data forecast for the 5 to 10-year horizon.
So can you walk us through a little bit what the very, very helpful point you just made, which is not all data uses are the same, right? So could you go through and maybe just give us an overview of the categories of the uses that you looked at? And the other question I have is the assessment of the demand inclusive of all demands, i.e. some would argue, well, really the wireless industry is just about consumers watching videos, cat videos on their phone. When in fact, if you look at the enterprise solutions that are being provided, my sense is we're talking about demand from pretty much every segment across the United States, not just the consumer, but also enterprise, et cetera. Is that true? And is that reflected in the kinds of data, categories of data you looked at?
That is definitely true. And Carolyn, one thing I think it's very important to sort of account for the fact that with 5G, we've seen so much fixed wireless deployment on the 5G. So it's not just the mobile network. The entire 5G ecosystem is much more than just sort of the mobile portion of it. And when thinking about data demand, all that needs to be figured into what data demand is going to look like in the future. And of course, we don't know what we know. There might be a lot more, there will probably be a lot more applications,
right?
Data hungry, but even what we know now, sort of, there's an explosion of data demand. And one thing that's important to realize is this is even, even when we take into account things like spectral efficiency, how efficient you're using your spectrum,
right?
That we sort of bring to the table before we figure out the spectrum deficit. So it's not just, oh, you're going to use the data in the same way you are, and then you're going to get a deficit. No, you're going to tremendously increase spectral efficiency, given sort of, our talk with engineers and some of the analysis we've seen. But even given that, we predict the deficit.
So you've taken it. So it sounds like you guys, as you do, very thorough. You have taken into account all of the, I would say, arguments against the push for making more full power licensed spectrum available for commercial use. You take into account, you can build your way out, but only up to a point. Yes, you can be more efficient, and people are working on that, and you will be more efficient. But yet, even taking into account all of that, your point is we're still going to hit a wall here, and we will need more full power licensed spectrum as an input.
That's right, because when you think about how can you sort of tackle any sort of demand deficit, right? In that case, well, you can think about demand reduction. That's probably never a good thing to do. And then on the supply side, as you mentioned, of course, you can increase infrastructure. We've taken a look at, how the macro network may be going, and we sort of use the CTIA resources for that. we've done a fair amount of research on small cell growth and looking at how small cell is going to grow over the next few years. There is going to be a huge explosion in small cell growth. However, as we all know, that between the macro and small cells, the small cells don't cover as much area, et cetera. There's a trade-off. So although the numbers might look very big, the impact on how much capacity they can handle is obviously not the same as the macro network. And we take that into account. So
Right.
that's the second way with infrastructure. The third, as you mentioned, was the technology and the technological efficiency. We've taken that into account. And ultimately, what we find is, given currently at least 64% of the demand needs to be satisfied by a spectrum input.
So a very basic question, but I think a very relevant one, because spectrum can get very technical as a topic inside the Beltway and outside, because it is a technical topic. But a question that I think goes to the heart of sometimes why policymakers are confused about this whole discussion. And that is, what is it about more spectrum into a network that actually results in better service? What is the relationship between spectrum and our calls working, our connection to the internet working and being robust?
So I think let me start with some of the trade-offs that people often talk about, right? If you don't have more spectrum, you can put in more towers. Well, there's a physical limit to how many towers you can put in, how much spectrum can be reused because of interference issues. So there's always a physical limit to what else you can do. And that is where your spectrum comes in. Because with more spectrum, of course, not only can you increase, depending on the type of spectrum, increase the coverage area, you can also increase the bandwidth and how much your network can actually accommodate in terms of data, so that you don't have connectivity issues. If you were calling, you don't have dropped calls. And now with 5G, we've gone even further, right? We're talking about ultra reliability, we're talking about IoT. So there are all these different kinds of things that are enabled by more spectrum that just having more infrastructure would not enable.
And so just to go back to the economics, what if the supply does not stay commensurate or ahead of demand? What does that look like? Are we looking at price increases? Are we looking at congested networks where I can't get on, my call won't go through? I actually had an experience with that out in a rural area not too long ago, where text messages weren't going through, phone calls weren't going through. And it's a location where ordinarily there's about 150 people. On this particular set of days, there were about 15,000. That to me was a perfect example of infrastructure being overwhelmed because of use, and therefore nothing worked. But if you could explain maybe a little bit better than I can.
No, that was good. Actually, what that reminds me of, I kind of like to think about this as two equilibriums, right? One is an equilibria where you're spectrum constrained, where you don't have enough spectrum. Is everything going to fall apart? No, because the wireless companies will put in the infrastructure, will spend the billions of dollars to make things work, maybe not as well as in a spectrum unconstrained world, but it'll work.
Right.
However, at what cost is the issue, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously it's going to be very expensive, and that will reflect probably not only just in the consumer side of things, it will also reflect in terms of the quality of the services that you get, in terms of innovation. It will have very far-reaching consequences. Whereas if you have a spectrum unconstrained future, that's where you have a lot of the positive spillovers, of the job creations that's going to happen.
So I know this was not really a focus of the new report, but I think you probably would have seen some of this research, which suggests that the United States is, I guess, a bit out of whack relative to allocations made over time for full power licensed versus unlicensed versus CBRS, which is the most recent example of shared, separate and apart from public-private partnerships like FirstNet or geographic sharing. How does all of that stack up compared to other countries? Are we kind of out in the hinterlands, kind of creating spectrum policy and a pipeline or lack thereof that is very, very different than what you're seeing other major trading partners doing?
that's an interesting question, right? Because while we would all like to be in the forefront, uh, especially given the lapse of auction authority and what's been happening to the spectrum pipeline, that I think has become a very critical issue currently.
Mhm.
And looking at the international market, it certainly seems like, if you look at I think there was an Analysys Mason survey that CTIA put, the US is not even amongst the top 10 in terms of licensed mid-band spectrum. And given that there is a need for at least a fair amount of exclusive spectrum so that, companies have built their whole networks on this, and there are certainly engineering things that are built on exclusivity. It probably says something about the fact that we are not in the top 10 in terms of the licensed mid-band spectrum. And there is, I think the number is somewhere around there's on average, we trail other countries by over 370 megahertz of spectrum, which is a fair amount.
Right.
Which is a fair amount. And yeah, that's why I think identifying the range of mid-band spectrum that can be fully licensed is important. And this is not to say sharing is not important. I think the sharing is important as a policy, but as a complementary policy to exclusive licensing, it is not a substitute.
So a question for you, as you know, NTIA is in the process under Scott Blake Harris of developing a national spectrum strategy, recognizing that, it's not just the commercial mobile industry that needs this input, but, lots of other actors in the United States, not the least of which is our military, also have very legitimate and pressing needs for access to spectrum. And the question is, how do we make all of this happen so that everybody has access to what they need? So I guess for you, were there any recommendations or suggestions that come to mind, either in your report or after you put it out in, listening to how this issue is evolving? Any suggestions for people like Scott at NTIA and others who are putting together a framework for how we get access to spectrum, not just for commercial, but for all of these other users?
So I think I was reading on the World Radio Congress and what they were doing at harmonizing various kinds of spectrum.
Right.
And I think looking at that and identifying to the full range of the 3.1 gigahertz, so 3.1 to 3.45, I think taking a look at that is really important. And despite sort of any of the federal issues that might come up in these contexts, looking at clearing and whether, if it cannot be cleared, the cost of clearing, doing a very thorough cost benefit analysis, and then figuring out, if a part of it should be unlicensed, a part should be licensed. All that has to come up after, I think, an extremely sort of rigorous cost benefit analysis of, what the puts and takes are of licensed versus unlicensed in these various bands. The other thing I think the WRC has considered, I think, is a 4 gigahertz spectrum. That is the other thing to consider in this, and also the 7 to 16, maybe for the future.
I believe the industry, the wireless industry, very clearly is trying to articulate, at least based on what I've read, that it's an all of the above approach to addressing this, right? You cannot solve for just one part of the equation. And so, as you said, there's a need for license full power. There's a need to figure out different ways of sharing. And there's also, a need for that analysis of incumbents with the policymakers to figure out truly, is it best for you to stay where you are, or can you do what you do better, more efficiently, and more cheaply somewhere else? So here's a question for you. When you look out at, let's assume that the FCC's auction authority is actually restored at some point this year. Any suggestions on what bands folks should be looking at in terms of the push on the Hill for pipeline legislation. So there was a push towards the end of last year. It didn't end up, getting into a bill that was signed. Sounds like negotiations and discussions are continuing to happen between industry, relevant folks at DoD, other stakeholders across different industries. So let's assume FCC auction authority is restored. What would you suggest be the next best place the Hill and the FCC look to find the next tranche of licensed full power spectrum that could be auctioned?
So I think the FCC has already done a lot of the legwork in this. Obviously, the lower 3 gigahertz comes to mind, and as we know, there's been a ton of discussion surrounding that. And the FCC has also talked about like efforts to free up like critical tranches of mid-band in the 4 gigahertz. That comes to mind. And as we've all seen, sort of in slightly the higher mid-band, the 12 gigahertz has been in the news, like both the lower and upper parts of the 12 gigahertz band. So I think these sort of seem to be sort of obvious candidates in sort of thinking about it. But I would say, if I had a crystal ball, probably the lower 3 gigahertz is sort of the first important.
The next prime candidate. Let me ask you a question that's don't really have an answer for. So, as an attorney, I hate to ask questions I don't know the answer for, but I'm just curious your thoughts on this one, which is, what is a productive way to be thinking through comparisons between intensity of use on licensed full power versus intensity of use on, let's say, CBRS spectrum? How would you think about that as an economist, or if you were to look at that question, like what's being used more intensively, or are they both being used intensively? How would you go about answering that question?
I think, Carolyn, that's the next paper I should write.
I did not mean to put you on the spot.
Not at all. I think these are very important questions, but certainly very complex.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of things that we did look at when we were doing this, sort of this research and thinking about all the various aspects of spectrum policy,
Mm-hmm.
was in terms of the intensity of use, looking not, suppose we are thinking about the CBRS spectrum, looking
Mm-hmm.
not just at the number of users who were using it, but how they were using it,
Mm-hmm.
also of the IoT that might come with it. And also on the flip side, on the exclusive spectrum, looking at both sort of all the various types of services that can sort of be accommodated. And that's where a lot of this fixed wireless push by Verizon and T-Mobile sort of comes in. So
Right.
I think to really answer your question, one needs to look at like a multi-pronged dimension of
Right.
each of these, and just looking at, pure, maybe a static view does not give the full picture. It also needs to be a dynamic view of what can be built on that spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I know we're running into the end of our session here, but you've been thinking through issues similar to what we're talking about here for quite a while, and I know along with your team at Brattle. So here's kind of a random question to throw at you, which is, any thoughts or suggestions or insights about how we can get people who are important to this conversation to actually engage on the data, as opposed to what we see, which is everyone's in their corners with their talking points, and it's this creating the impression that it's a zero-sum game, either trying to create the impression that the industry is looking for 100% of all spectrum everywhere, nobody gets anything else, which is obviously a dramatization and not accurate. But there does seem to be this desire by folks, in the Beltway advocacy game, to try to make this into a zero-sum game. Any thoughts or suggestions on how we prevent that from happening, just from your years of being here and working on some of these issues yourself?
I think webinars like this are important.
Mm-hmm.
Getting people sort of, spectrum is a difficult topic, right?
Yeah.
And it's easy to take extreme positions without understanding that, there is a middle ground that makes the entire thing much better.
Right.
And therefore, I think more sort of database research like we've done, like the CTIA does, I think is going to be important. And on both sides, like whichever camp anyone belongs to, there is really a middle ground where the data speaks for itself, and then we can figure out, all the above solutions, how to use all of them, both sort of the exclusive licensing, the sharing, the offload discussions are going to become very important.
Right.
All that taken together should form a spectrum policy going forward.
So we have one last question in the chat, and that is, what about satellite spectrum? The question is, would we ever consider auctioning off rights to satellite spectrum? And how is satellite coverage a potential solution for enterprise, high-speed mobile broadband?
I think currently in rural areas, satellite is a fairly good avenue to reach consumers. Now, whether that works in urban areas, et cetera, will remain to be seen.
Right.
But I think it is something that's complementary to what we have today. And we will see how that goes. And I think there are a lot of international countries that are thinking about auctioning satellite spectrum. And I'm curious and eagerly waiting to see how those go.
Well, I think we've come up with at least 2 new research projects for you, Paroma.
Well, there you go. Yes. Next TBRC, Carolyn.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very, very, very much for taking the time out to discuss your report, which I think is so important. The other thing I really like about it, which is also consistent with the work you've done before, is it's very easy to understand and to read. Some of the papers I've seen on spectrum can get very technical, and unless you have that PhD in engineering, it's a little bit confusing. So I thank you very much for treating a difficult topic in a way that's very accessible to pretty much anybody out there, including those of us with an English major degree.
So thank you, Carolyn. I always think about something that one of my engineer colleagues had told me when I first joined the FCC. He looked at me and said, no matter how much you try, you can't violate the laws of physics. So think about simply what it is you're trying to say, boil it down, and then figure out whether it makes sense or not. And this is exactly that, us trying to sort of boil it down and figuring out what is important, and to get the message out there about sort of the deficit and the fact that policymakers really need to act if the US is going to be on a good path in terms of spectrum availability.
Well, thank you again. And for anyone who hasn't read it, I would definitely recommend it. Again, it's How Much Licensed Spectrum is Needed to Meet Future Demands for Network Capacity by the Brattle Group. Thank you again, and we look forward to having you back, Roma.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Have a great rest of the day.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.